Italian plan was this. From Ethiopia, one army under the Duke of Aosta was to advance upon Egypt from the south. Another, under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, was to drive east from Libya. Combined strength of the two armies totaled 500,000 men. Their opponents, hard-pressed at home, feeling the weight of the Nazi blitz against England, mustered 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops. The Italian attack began well. Graziani's forces struck at Egypt. It was the greatest opportunity Italy had to increase her empire. These troops might have raced through Egypt and joined with the other Italian force in Ethiopia. But the goal of a great empire turned into an illusion, ultimately to disaster. The dreams of glory promulgated by Il Duce did not match with reality. The desert terrain was fearsome. Although the Italians dreamt of glory, the hard work involved in attaining it was another matter. The troops were often sick, always homesick. Morale became low. Italian tacticians made many mistakes. These mistakes proved costly. Under General Wavell, British forces surprised them at Sidi Barrani on December the 9th. The Italians had dallied there. Mussolini had threatened Graziani with loss of command if they didn't move on into Egypt. Now too late. British armor raced along the Libyan coast. Marshal Graziani had made a costly error by turning these coastal towns into fortresses, walled with barbed wire, guns, and anti-tank ditches. They would prove to be no match for the highly mobile British. El Solam, Bardia, Tobruk, Derma. One after another, the towns fell to the British. Benghazi. The Italians made a hasty exit, retired from the city. They were cut off by fast-moving armor and motorized infantry. The Italian army was trapped. British Empire forces captured over 133,000 prisoners. Their own losses, 604 men. By February the 8th, 1941, they occupied the eastern half of Libya, as far as the town of El Agila. General Wavell's victory in Libya protected Egypt on the west and left him free to destroy the Italian army in Ethiopia. The blitzkrieg tactics used by Germany so successfully were now employed by the British against the Axis partner. Under orders from Rome, the Duke of Aosta made a last stand, but by May the 19th, all Italian resistance had ended. Ethiopia, first of the fascist conquests, was liberated. The Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his kingdom. In Libya, British troops halted at El Agila. The weakening of the British forces coincided with the arrival in Africa of a man who was to become of historic importance. February the 12th, 1941, General Erwin Rommel, veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, arrived to take command of the Africa Corps. By March the 11th, the 5th Panzer Regiment had completed its disembarkation in Tripoli, equipped with 120 tanks and the most modern and fearsome of German war equipment. Rommel attacked the weakened British position on March the 24th. He continued to advance, the British continued to withdraw. On April the 1st, the Germans moved into Benghazi. Rommel had seized the initiative. He proved a formidable foe who commanded respect even though serving in the enemy cause. His strategy in using the awesome Mark III and Mark IV tanks, which outranged the British in firepower, was amazingly skillful. The British were forced to stabilize their forces farther to the east. The British had been pushed back into Egypt, but the retreat was not complete. One Australian division remained in Tobruk, a constant threat to Rommel's flank. Nazi propagandist Lord Haw called them the Rats of Tobruk. The term became an endearing one. The efforts to dislodge them cost Rommel time and strength. The area of Tobruk was about twice the size of the District of Columbia. The town itself consisted of plain one-story stucco buildings arranged in half a dozen crisscrossing streets. Rommel's intention was to attack Tobruk as quickly as possible, before the British had recovered from the onslaught of the Afrika Korps. The combined offensive he ordered on April the 10th was brought to a halt. His attacks on the 11th and 14th were also unsuccessful. By May the 2nd, Rommel had taken Solom, Capuzzo, had reconquered the rest of Cyrenaica. Tobruk held on. Rommel's greatest attack had failed to dislodge the gallant and heroic opposition. Few of the men in Tobruk ever had a roof over their heads. Strip life of everything that makes it worthwhile, and you have the standard of living in Tobruk at this time. Water was scant. Rations were merely a means of keeping alive. Only the essentials came through. Supply lines from air and sea were worth their weight in gold. The story of the desert in the summer of 1941 was the story of Tobruk. At the end of August, the Australian garrison was relieved. And colonial empire forces moved in. Tobruk was a severe thorn in the side of Rommel. This fine port, under British control, forced the Germans to move 1,500 tons of supplies daily over open desert wastes. Tobruk was sorely needed as a supply point close to the front. Thus, the siege was strengthened during September. On the morning of December the 4th, Rommel launched a heavy attack that was very nearly successful. The war in North Africa teetered back and forth. On May the 26th, 1942, the German offensive was launched in full force. Said Rommel, "To every man of us, Tobruk was a symbol of British resistance, and we were now going to finish it for good." Tobruk fell at 5 a.m. June the 21st, 1942. On June the 22nd, Rommel learned from Hitler's headquarters that he was a field marshal. Wrote Rommel to his wife, "I would much rather he had given me one more division." prize Rommel had sought for over a year was finally his. At great cost to both sides. June the 30th. The Axis forces came to the El Alamein line. Alexandria was 65 miles away. The Germans had won a great victory at Tobruk and were moving rapidly. Field Marshal Rommel was at the peak of his professional career. It was at this time that General Auchinleck received a distinguished visitor from England. Mr. Churchill stayed for 5 days. Other new arrivals remained permanently. They were General Sir Harold R.L.G. Alexander, who replaced General Auchinleck as commander of the Middle East, and General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, who took over General Rich's 8th Army. Your prime and main duty will be to take or destroy at the earliest opportunity the German and Italian army commanded by Field Marshal Rommel, together with all its supplies and establishments in Egypt and Libya. Signed, Winston Churchill. General Montgomery took hold at El Alamein. Meanwhile, Lend-Lease supplies rolled in. President Roosevelt ordered every spare Sherman tank shipped to North Africa. Both sides were girding for what obviously was to be a decisive battle. The British plan for the forthcoming Battle of El Alamein was to be the turning point in the Desert War. That was certain. All prayed that it should turn in their favor. The plan itself was simple. Blow a hole in the German positions, send in strong armor, and keep widening the gap. The Axis line at El Alamein was a maze of strong points for 35 miles. During October 1942, they were hit mercilessly from the air. Axis shipping was badly damaged. Thus, the stage was set. There was no secrecy about the British plan. General Montgomery had made it known to every man. In a personal message to his troops, he said, "The battle which is now about to begin will be one of the decisive battles of history. It will be the turning point of the war. The eyes of the whole world will be on us, watching anxiously which way the battle will swing. We can give them their answer at once. It will swing our way." Montgomery had said, "Give me a fortnight and I can resist the German attack. Give me 3 weeks and I can defeat the Boche. Give me a month and I will chase him out of Africa." Thus he instilled in his troops his own supreme confidence. They prepared. Guns ready. Equipment ready. Men ready. General's troops were confident. German and Italian radios began promising complete independence for the Egyptian people and made dates for the Africa Corps with the ladies of Cairo and Alexandria upon their victory. October the 23rd, 1942, afternoon. While they could, Montgomery's men also relaxed and waited. In late afternoon, the British forces moved to the assembly areas. "9:40 p.m. A still desert night. The Battle of El Alamein begins. Guns had broken the silence. The roar was heard in Alexandria, over 60 miles away. The 8th Army was unleashed. General Montgomery chose the north to make a breakthrough. It would threaten the coastal road, which was the enemy's life, and would imperil his forces to the south. By dawn on the 24th, the Axis main defenses were bitten deep. Luftwaffe tried to halt Montgomery's forces in vain. British air power blasted them from the skies. By the 27th, all Axis reserve strength had concentrated in the north. An advanced position called Kidney Ridge was counterattacked 5 times in a single day by the 15th Panzers, but held out. October the 29th. After bitter fighting, the 9th Australian Division advanced due north across the coast road to a strong point known as Thompson's Post. There they stayed, while the enemy was hit by the RAF. Gradually, the enemy was drawn to the north. It was the moment General Montgomery had been waiting for. With Rommel concentrating everything to the north, gaps in the line were made to the south. And during November the 2nd and 3rd, the whole weight of the 8th Army poured west. The Germans were caught off balance. Taking advantage of the enemy's weakness, the British forces broke through all along the line. Said Rommel, "We were completely stunned. For the first time during the African campaign, I did not know what to do." His army was relentlessly pushed back. On came the British, back past the old familiar places. The Axis had suffered its first great defeat. The tide had turned. It was, as Winston Churchill said, the end of the beginning.
There were 123 days in which to get ready. Hundreds of ships to be prepared. Ships armed and loaded with some 700,000 items of equipment. Tons of supplies, stockpiled for what was to come. Vast numbers of troops suddenly found themselves engaged in intensive training. As the days passed, it was evident that something big was at hand, big enough to involve a maximum effort from two continents, from both Britain and America. But what? October 24, 1942. While the British 8th Army was smashing Rommel and the Germans at El Alamein, a vast troop convoy set sail from American ports. The next day, two convoys left Britain. In all, 3 convoys, 700 ships, traveling 5,000 miles. yet, the men aboard the convoys had no hope of their undertaking. Nothing to do but relax and wonder. Destination unknown. Speculations plentiful. Rumors even more so. As the days crawled by, tension mounted. What lay ahead for them and where? Finally, the secret was out. North Africa. The men were fully aware of the bitter fighting waged there for 3 years, of the Afrika Korps and Tobruk. And as the convoy steamed onward, a bulletin was received of the retreat of the German army, resulting from the shattering El Alamein battle. The plan, invasion. The objective, rout the Axis powers from North Africa. The invasion was to be made hundreds of miles west of El Alamein at 3 points: Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. General Mark Clark had previously landed in Algeria to confer with French officers. General Henri Giraud would lead the Free French forces. The entire operation was under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At 3 a.m. on November 8th, the convoys converged west of Gibraltar. The events planned 4 months ago were about to become history. Now, everything depended upon taking the enemy by surprise. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. speaks.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African army will contest our landing. But all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally.
This was Casablanca, the northwest corner of Africa. H hour. The invasion began. The ensuing events now in the hands of fate. It was also H hour at Algiers. Planes based at Gibraltar flew over to give extra insurance for the success of the operation. And it was a success. Opposition in Algiers was slight. In a short time, it was in Allied hands. Oran, H hour. Here the paratroops went into action. Fighting was bitter, but after 2 hard days, troops of the enemy Vichy French capitulated. Oran was taken, 2 down, 1 to go. But at the Atlantic port of Casablanca, there was trouble. The Vichy French Navy still fought for the Axis. Fighting on the water was heavy. Allied guns pounded the port and the Vichy fleet. The battle lasted for 5 grueling days. But on November 12, Vichy Deputy Chief of State Admiral Darlan reached an agreement with General Eisenhower and ordered all French in Africa to cooperate with the Allies. Resistance ceased at Casablanca. The troops rolled in. Of the prisoners taken, none seemed to be very popular with the civilians. The greatest invasion in military history was a success. The enemy had been taken by surprise. The first phase in the Allied invasion of North Africa was over. In addition to General Eisenhower, the British First Army was commanded by General Anderson. The French troops were under General Giraud. The next step, move east swiftly. Time was precious. The Allies moved toward the Tunisian border, hoping to reach Bizerte and Tunis before the Germans could rush in reinforcements. We pushed on, despite all but impossible roads and shoddy railroad facilities. But still we moved on, by land and in the air, which was our best means of transportation. And it was by air that the German forces struck back. As they did, German reinforcements poured in from Sicily. November 18, the Allied advance guards entered Tunisia. Our line of supply was now 500 miles long. Fast. We had to. By November 22, the town of Beja was reached. Mejaz al-Bab, the terrain became more and more precarious. November 25, at Mejaz al-Bab, the first tank battle occurred. The Germans lost 15 tanks and withdrew. They moved back to the mountain approaches in the northern tip of Tunisia. At Matur, they waited. We attempted a thrust. It was all important. Time was running out. Winter was coming. This time, we failed. The Germans were too strongly emplaced. We fell back. The Tunisian front was now stabilized on a line running north and south from Mejes El Bab. For the North African winter had come. The war bogged down in a morass of mud. Hopes for a lightning victory in North Africa were forgotten. Airfields were flooded. Bad roads became worse. With the line stabilized, the war became a waiting game. Daily reports at the time would say action was light on the Tunisian front. Actually, this light action accounted for half our casualties in the campaign. During this time, patrols were sent out continuously. If they were lucky, a few of the captive enemy would be returned. Sometimes they weren't so lucky. In the clouds, there was more activity. In a single week, Allied planes destroyed 241 enemy aircraft. We lost 89. From our bases, it was possible to make devastating attacks on Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily. But the main activity during this lull was the Battle of Supply. Both sides girded themselves. The British 8th Army was racing west from Libya to meet us. In Tunisia, the winter would soon be over. The crucial struggle loomed ahead. But there was one day when the struggle was momentarily forgotten. A day dedicated to peace on earth. Christmas in Tunisia, 1942. January 14, 1943. American troops in Casablanca were startled to see a familiar face from home. The president arrived. And Prime Minister Churchill came. General Charles de Gaulle and General Giraud were brought together to unite the fighting men of France. The Casablanca Conference was underway. It was held to set the requirements for victory, not only in North Africa, but all over the world. The ultimate object, no appeasement, no negotiation, nothing short of complete victory over the enemy. In the Civil War, General Grant had first used the term. Now President Roosevelt used it, unconditional surrender. The stage was set. After the conference, Mr. Churchill flew to Tripoli and greeted General Montgomery. The climax in North Africa was approaching. But there was still fight in the enemy. The veteran 21st Panzer Division attacked, and German armor overran the Kasserine Pass. However, infantry and artillery support from the 9th and 34th Divisions, plus British units and bombers, stopped the Germans and drove them back through the pass. Though a setback to the Allies, there was something gained. The troops became, in General Eisenhower's words, battle-wise and tactically efficient. It was the last Nazi offensive in Africa. By this time, the British 8th Army had caught up with Rommel's forces at the Mareth Line. On March 15, 1943, Rommel was recalled to Germany. He never returned. His army had retired to the Mareth Line's fortified hills. With the Americans at Magnassi and the French to the south, Montgomery kept up a pounding assault on the line to divide Axis reserves. Pinning the enemy in front, he flanked to the left and delivered a telling blow. The New Zealanders moved on this flank. The 4th Indian Division circled the rear. American armor closed in, supported by heavy air assault. And the Mareth Line cracked. The Nazis abandoned the field with Allied armor on their heels. The battle-wise 1st Armored Division pushed east to cut off the enemy retreat. General Patton saw them close on the enemy flank. April 7, 1943, a big day. British patrols met advance guards of the American 2nd Corps on the Gab Road. Thus, Allied lines were linked. Now the British 8th could be supplied from North African ports, and troops could be shuttled along the entire Tunisian front. The U.S. 2nd Corps, under General Bradley, moved north to the Beja Road, which ran to Bizerti. The end was in sight. April 20, the British 8th opened the final offensive. Anfidaville was taken, and the natives began to return to their homes. Relentlessly, the Allies pushed onward to Bizerti and Tunis. The going was slow, tough, and dangerous because the enemy was holed up in the surrounding hills. Key positions often changed hands several times before the German defenders were forced to fall back. Hill after hill was stormed or flanked in bitter fighting. Our big attack was at Jabal Tahent, Hill 609. It was a main enemy position. On April 28 and 29, the enemy laid down a heavy mortar fire, and we replied with artillery as we attempted to storm the heights. The going was rough. On May 1, we took Hill 609. The plan for victory in the northern tip of Tunisia had been likened to a cylinder, a machine to compress the enemy until he was destroyed. The compression was about to show results. Swiftly, one by one, the towns on the road to Tunis and Bizerti fell. Matur, Massacolt, Ferryville. There was no stopping the Allied push now. The enemy found themselves forced into a pocket from which there was no escape. the Nazis may have invented the Blitzkrieg, we were improving on it. The armor forged ahead. Tanks broke through enemy lines. On May 7, 1943, the Germans were surprised by the Allied arrival outside Tunis. There was no organized resistance. For the Germans, there was no front left. The town of Tunis was turned into a carnival. The streets were so full of crowds and celebrations, traffic could hardly move. The same day, May 7th, at almost the same hour, we entered Bizerte. The reception here was not so jubilant. Hitler had ordered his troops to fight to the last cartridge, but there was no fight to the finish. Still fond of parades and brass bands, they marched in. Total, wholesale surrender. Among the 267,000 prisoners taken were 14 German and 4 Italian generals. Although our losses were relatively light, we had destroyed 250 enemy tanks and 2,330 aircraft. Now Air Marshal Tedder launched a furious assault upon Italian islands off the Tunisian coast. By June 13, the last ones were taken. The conquest of North Africa was complete. Now the Middle East was safe. Africa was liberated. And from there came re-echoing the phrase that would be fulfilled in the invasion of Italy, D-Day, VE Day, unconditional surrender. El Alamein had been the end of the beginning. For the Axis powers, it was now the beginning of the end.
The hour was at hand. In the last days of June 1943, thousands of Canadian troops, men of the 1st Canadian Division, set sail in 2 enormous convoys to a destination as yet unknown. 3 years of battle-minded training, months of careful planning, intense organization. Men, machines, and material were going into history with this convoy.
One thing sure, this floating camp's heading for 0 hour, somewhere south. This is no training scheme, not when they hand out tropical kits and light uniforms. They don't let you rust aboard ship. There's plenty to keep you busy. Periods in semaphore, aircraft recognition, and what's the soldier's life without washing and cleaning up? And, of course, some deep thinking. The Navy's on the job, all right. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, corvettes. You get a feeling nothing can happen with all that stuff around. Ready to pace the U-boats to kingdom come. Blow the Jerry pilots into the drink.
It wasn't until the convoy had passed Gibraltar on the non-stop trip from Scotland that the troops were told where they were going.
Sicily. After 3 years, our first real chance. We can forget all that grousing and squawking. We're going to know our geography in a way we never learned in school. We're going to make the most of it. Every job begins to mean something more. Getting our kit together, filling grenades, dabbing a bit more oil on the rifle, checking and double-checking, writing that extra letter home to the folks, the girlfriend. Knowing where you're going makes a difference. It's not training anymore.
From Tunis, Bizerte, Sousse, a tremendous convoy joined with the Canadians. Over 3,000 vessels under a canopy of air power aimed their prows at Sicily, cockpit of history. Throughout the entire 2,000-mile trip, the weather favored the convoy. As 0 hour approached, a storm of gale proportions blew up. Landing craft could not work in that sea. If the continued operations might prove too risky, have to be postponed. Commander-in-Chief of Allied Naval Forces in the Mediterranean made his decision.
We are about to embark on the most momentous enterprise of the war, striking for the first time at the enemy in his own land.
The big show was on. Allied invasion craft sped to 7 landing points along 100 miles of coastline. Allied guns blasted at 0 hour.
Force have done their job getting us here. Now it's our job to stay. We're nervous. Some of us are seasick. Outside of that, it's just like a training scheme back in England. There's some machine gun fire, but we're ready for anything they can throw at us.
Mare Nostrum. Our sea, no longer the sea of the fascists, now the sea of the men of the United Nations. By dawn, the very lights, signals of Allied success, flared skyward as the assault waves stormed their first objective. Canadian soldiers had gone through the beach defenses in a matter of minutes. Men from the far west, the maritime east, wheat fields and the prairies, the farms and factories, the mines and lumber camps, ready to prove that battle was their business. 100 miles of invasion coastline jammed with Allied troops made perfect targets for enemy bomb sites. As the naval and air forces crumbled the coastal defenses of the Axis, Canadians, British, and Americans kept surging onto the beaches. 14,000 vehicles, 600 tanks, 1,800 guns, 160,000 men. Every branch of the service worked together as a team, unloading weapons and supplies and smashing the enemy. General Montgomery, impressed with Canadian battle efficiency, greeted the troops, telling them they were terrific, first-rate fighters. With Allied beachheads established, the Americans struck westward, the British northward, and the Canadians were set to drive a spearhead into the center toward Enna, the Axis headquarters. That first week, the infantry captured many towns. An unending torrent of tanks was grinding its way to the heart of Sicily. Axis resistance was weak. The real enemy was heat. The men were eating their own dust all the way. Among the first to distinguish themselves were the Royal Canadian Regiment, the Loyal Edmonton, the Three Rivers Tank Regiment, the Princess Pats, the Seaforth, the Van Duze, the Hastings and Prince Edwards, the 48 Highlanders. The Canadians were moving on and fast. After a stiff fight on the plains and hills near Piazza Armerina, the infantrymen were proving the training. The town fell to an attack led by the loyal Edmontons. In 7 days, the Allied advance had occupied 1/4 of all Sicily. The Axis moved its headquarters from Enna to Randazzo.
In the first week, we nabbed our first fascist general. General Dade looked well fed, but had no stomach for real fighting. But the Italian soldiers act happy. There's thousands of them anxious to surrender. It don't look to me like their hearts are in it, fighting for Il Duce and the Nazis. But this show hasn't been a picnic. The enemy doesn't give up as easily everywhere. We put the Nazis where they belong. Some of our boys got it too. That only makes us want to get on with the job of wiping out the Nazis and their fascist pals. We've got a score to settle all over the world.
The second week saw the Americans subdue the western half of the island, while the British drove northward to the approaches of Catania. The Canadians, with the Americans on their left, began their march on Enna. On the hills south of Enna, the Royal 22nd, West Novas, and Carleton and York smashed the Germans. The Nazis, veterans of years of fighting, were learning to fear the red patch devils of the 1st Division, veterans of 2 weeks fighting. Meanwhile, the 2nd Brigade pushed on to Leonforte. With the seaports and Edmontons preparing the way, and supported by tanks and artillery, the Princess Pat stormed the town. The limestone skeletons of towns, the booby traps, the littered equipment, the smashed tanks, all mute testimony to the bitter retreat of the enemy. With the capture of Leonforte, plans were already being mapped by Generals Montgomery and Simmons to crush Agira. Meanwhile, the men took a well-earned rest.
First thing we do after a fight is get off our feet and lie in the shade, if there is any shade, and take it easy. Some of us haven't slept for 3 days. Our first bath only took off the top layer of dust. This country is lousy with fruit, but the heat here is enough to fry a chicken. Jokes aside, the food we get is swell, and lots of it. Got to credit the Army Service Corps for feeding us. The first few days we were too nervous to eat for the fighting. Now the cook says we're real vets. You just can't feed us enough.
More than 2/3 of Sicily now lay in Allied hands. To the Canadians fell the task of overcoming the Nazi mountain stronghold, Agira. Prior to that, Asolo had fallen to the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, which clawed its way up a 2,500-foot precipice to capture the town. De Soria, scene of some of the bloodiest fighting of the whole campaign, was taken in a combined action of the RCRs and the 48th. Now General Simmons was ready to mount his attack on Agira. Cracked German troops faced the Canadians. For the artillery, it was a dream come true, and they prepared to lay down the heaviest artillery concentration of the entire campaign in preparation for the attack. Every gun let the Germans have it. Sheets of flame flashed over gun positions for half a mile or more. Fighting continued into the next day. The artillery concentration was too much for the Germans. The dried grass was still smoking from the shelling when the infantry attacked. Algiers fell to the Canadians on the 28th of July, 1943. It had been another triumph for the 2nd Brigade, supported by tanks and machine gunners of the Saskatoon Light Infantry. The Canadian 1st Division had won its battle spurs as part of Montgomery's famed 8th Army. As the pipes of the Seaforth Highlanders from Canada's west coast celebrated the victory, the Royal Canadian Engineers cleared the roads of hidden German mines. The Canadians were heading for Regalbuto, one of the key points of the Nazi defense system. Our troops met with cratered roads, roadblocks, blown bridges. The battle-wise Nazis were putting up fierce and skillful resistance at every natural barrier. It was a delaying action.
First, we had to smash the enemy positions in the hills around the town. It took us 3 days. Every house, every street. The Jerrys were covering every window. We went after them with everything we had. In these last weeks, we learned a lot. Grenades, Tommy guns, cold steel. There were a lot of dead Jerrys when our boys were through. Those that were alive were so stunned they couldn't speak. The Nazis were nervous and jumpy. It was hell for them. It wasn't a picnic for us.
Our troops had to pay in sweat and blood. If a Canadian soldier was wounded in action, within seconds an expert medical soldier was at his side. He was rushed to safety by truck, jeep, mule. The more seriously wounded were flown out on a clockwork schedule. The best surgical care, the most delicate major operations were performed with skill and patience, close to the firing line. Medical Corps personnel saved the lives of thousands of Canadian soldiers, men needed for the battles to come. In the central sector, the Canadians pushed on towards Adrano, while the Americans and British were unable to race along the coast roads to Messina, last Axis stronghold, thus completing the conquest of Sicily, ending the first round in the battle for Europe. First time in this war that British, Canadian, and American troops had combined in a large-scale operation. The first time a major Canadian force had seen action. In 38 days, out of the heat and dust, out of the hard mountain fighting and decisive victories, the Red Patch Devils had emerged soldiers equal to the best. It was the United Nations victory. This was the Axis toll. Thousands of dead, 260 tanks, 500 guns, more than 1,500 planes destroyed and captured, and over 100,000 prisoners of war. The soldier, the worker, the farmer, the people of Canada had won. Here was the key to victory everywhere.
Nazi equipment and troops came pouring down into Italy. Hitler had anticipated the collapse of Mussolini's regime and lost no time strengthening the defenses of southern Italy. Allied strategy called for a preliminary British attack on the Calabrian Peninsula, followed 6 days later by a combined Allied attack on the Gulf of Salerno and another British attack to the south. By invading Italy at 3 points, we hoped to throw the enemy forces into confusion. Naples was the #1 objective. Its capture could give us the use of a first-class harbor. Our bombers had blasted strategic points for 2 months. At dawn on September 3rd, the British crossed the narrow strait from Sicily to Italy. In the various ports of the Mediterranean, units of the combined British and American armies were assembled for the attack on the Gulf of Salerno. Vessels of all categories rushed to the Mediterranean from other theaters, provided barely enough shipping space to transport our men and equipment. At Oran in Africa, the 36th Division embarked to go into battle for the first time. They were scheduled to spearhead the invasion in the American zone. The 45th Division embarked at Palermo. These hardened troops were scheduled to reinforce the initial assault troops. General Clark and Admiral Hewitt worked together. Convoy units left Oran, Bizerte, and Tripoli on the 5th and 6th of September. Our troops were told of the unconditional surrender of Italy on the same day. Here was the first break in the coils of a war that gripped the whole world. The bulk of the Italian fleet, by prearrangement, sailed to Malta. Italian airmen flew their planes to Allied air bases in Tunisia. Formal surrender closed this chapter of Italian history. Meanwhile, on the heights above Salerno, the Nazis were preparing a deadly reception for the Fifth Army. They zeroed their gun batteries on every foot of the beach. On the eve of the assault, they were ready and waiting for us. Allied strategy called for attacks by the British 10th Corps on the left and the American 6th Corps on the right, with the Sele River as the corps boundary. The success of our invasion hung on the speed with which we could cross the coastal plain to the wall of mountains 8 to 10 miles inland. At dawn, September 9th, the 36th Division hit the beach without cover of a naval barrage. The Nazis, having anticipated the landing, pinned our combat teams down with interdiction fire. Nazi dive bombers slashed at our transports and warships. They scored some damaging hits. Reinforcements from the 45th Division were poured ashore at critical points to stand off the German counterattacks. Our tanks came ashore to support the hard-pressed infantry. We continued to pour men and equipment into the narrow strip of land along the Gulf of Salerno. Allied naval guns threw their utmost support to the hard-pressed ground forces. The cruiser Savannah fought up and down the shoreline. Casualties were heartbreakingly heavy. The Savannah was forced to withdraw. German field artillery, emplaced in the hills directly above the British invasion beach, pounded the British landing forces. After a savage struggle, British commandos took the town of Salerno. Units of the British 10th Corps drove across the open plains toward the Nazi airfield at Monte Corino. we desperately needed a fighter plane air base in Italy. Construction of an air base in the American zone, out of range of German artillery, was started on D+2. The first strip was completed in 24 hours. Planes began using the field before it was ready for normal operation. Crash landings were common during the first few days. Artillery was a key factor in beating off the main German counterattacks. British forces advancing steadily from the toe and heel of the peninsula forced the Germans to withdraw from southern Italy. On September 16th, contact between the 8th Army and the 5th Army was made south of the Salerno beachhead. In the ruins of an ancient Greek temple in the American sector, we set up a well-equipped first aid station and evacuation center. Extremely heavy casualties had been the price of victory for the 36th and 45th Divisions. Divisions of the British 10th Corps, too, had suffered heavily. Fresh troops moved into the line. We drove ahead, close on the heels of the retreating enemy. Our main objective, Naples. Through Battipaglia, the battle for the beachhead had raged 3 times. Taken, lost, and now retaken, this war-torn little town, which had been filled with attractive, substantial homes only a week before, had become a fantastic heap of ruins. In 8 days, the 5th Army advanced 30 miles against the sullenly retreating Germans. Eboli, shattered by our advancing artillery, was evacuated without a fight. Campania was practically wiped out. At Salerno, we raced through. In some towns, our troops were frequently delayed by small rear guard detachments, which had to be blasted out one at a time. German prisoners were interrogated on the field and gave our intelligence officers some valuable information. Destroyed bridges slowed our advance, enabling the Nazis to keep ahead of us by that vital one step. The 6th Corps moved into position to take the mountains east of Naples. Near the coast, the British 10th Corps struck northwest through the mountains to the Sorrento Peninsula. On October 1st, the 5th Army marched into Naples. The Nazis had evacuated their forces from the city, but not before they had vented their rage on it. Liberated civilians who had risen against the Germans on their last day greeted the Allied troops hysterically. With typical German savagery, the city had been torn apart. There was no water, no sanitation, no fire protection. The city was on the verge of complete moral collapse. The Nazis had sunk ships alongside the docks and dumped cranes and freight cars on top of them. The railroad yards were a shambles. Huge caves and demolished buildings served as bomb shelters and homes for thousands of Neapolitans. Many had known no other homes for more than a year. Those who had fled from the fury of the Germans returned to find their homes looted and burned. The Allied military government, after a quick survey, took over the food distribution of the city. A time bomb planted in the post office exploded a week after the Germans fled the city. More than 100 people were blown to death, most of them civilians, many of them children. Thus, and in many other bestial ways, did Hitler and his generals seek revenge on their former Axis partners. Before the war, along the 7.5 miles of Naples waterfront, there had been 14 berths for ocean-going vessels and innumerable docks for smaller craft. The wrecked harbor was handed over to 12,000 Seabees. And miraculously soon it was back in operation. Indeed, in a short time, it was handling more shipping than before the war. We now had an adequate port for our coming operations up through the shank of the boot. Thousands of tons of food were brought in for distribution to the civilian population of Naples. The Allied military government set up a rationing system and appointed trustworthy Italian officials to supervise its execution. Within a few months, the city began to show a new face. The empty shells of buildings were torn down, and the salvaged material was used to erect new structures. There was still starvation. War was still nearby. But among the populace, normal human relations were again possible. A feeling of security began to grow. By early October 1943, the Allied armies in Italy had attained their initial strategic objective. By keeping pressure on the enemy in Italy, the Allies hoped to keep German troops from the critical Russian front. The German 10th Army withdrew to the hills north of the Volturno and prepared for a determined stand. Our first obstacle, the Volturno, a river winding through mountain and valley to the sea. 3 days' rain had caused the river to rise 6 feet. At some points, it had overflown its banks, swelling to a width of 200 to 300 feet. The 5th Army, made up of the 10th British Corps and 6th American Corps, was deployed along the southern bank of the river. The British 10th Corps front extended from the coast to Capua. The American 6th Corps area extended 35 miles east from Capua to the rocky slopes of the Matesa Range. Midnight 12th October, the 6th Division struck simultaneously on a 40-mile front. The enemy gave ground. Early the next morning, engineers, wet and cold, still wearing summer issue, fought the rough Volturno. Engineers supporting the 34th Division lost equipment, had to change location twice because of enemy fire. The river was 70 feet wider at this location. Against all obstacles, the bridge was completed. 2 days later, 15th October, over our newly constructed span of Triflisco Gap, British Bren gun carriers crossed the Volturno. The crossing of the Volturno was a battle of construction and supply. With equipment and supporting weapons moving steadily across our bridges, the battle had been won, and the 6th Corps was ready to pursue the retreating enemy. At Alvignano, occupied the morning of 17th October, Major General Ryder, commander of the 34th, ordered Colonel Butler, commanding the 168th Infantry, to drive on to Dragogne, 2 miles to the northwest. On our right flank, the 36th Artillery supported the 45th Division. This assault struck at the last line of hills, barring the approach to the upper Volturno Valley. Casualties were high. In a single day, the 6th Corps lost 545 men. 1 regiment lost 3 battalion commanders in 12 days. In early October, American-Japanese fighters of the 100th Infantry Battalion arrived at Alvignano. Composed entirely of 2nd and 3rd generation Americans, this outfit was alerted for immediate action in the 34th Division zone. All along the front, we killed and captured enemy rear guard forces who fought delaying action. By 18th October, the 3rd and 34th Divisions were converging on Draconie. Throughout the day, the 3rd Division shelled Dragogne. The next day, the town was occupied by the 168th without opposition. Some prisoners from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier and 26th Panzer Divisions were taken. They reported heavy casualties. The 45th Division, attacking northeast from Fecchio, advanced to Piedmonte d'Alife, supporting a second crossing of the Volturno by the 34th. 45th Artillery barraged a small village, while the 34th fired on the Alife-Piedmonte road. The infantry pushed over rough terrain. By 20th October, Piedmonte d'Alife and the nearby town of Alife were both occupied. Our forward troops were pressing the enemy close. But now, in order to keep men, vehicles, and supplies moving, a great battle of reconstruction began. A treadway bridge constructed with the aid of a mobile crane. Our advance depended on our engineers. They worked fast. It wasn't only demolitions which faced American engineers. There was continuous rain, culverts to be dug, entirely new roads constructed. The war in Italy has been frequently called the War of Roads and Bridges. Infantry and engineers fought as a team. Enemy demolitions were calculated to hold us up for more than 24 hours. But in a matter of a few hours, bridges and approaches were in operation again. The 45th Division, in action ever since it landed at Salerno, withdrew into Corps Reserve. The 34th and 3rd pushed northward, driving for the Capriati of Volturno, and for the opening in the mountains near Mignano, known as the Mignano Gap. Elements of the 34th, held back by the enemy for 2 days, entered Prata the 29th October. On our left flank, the 3rd Division on 27th October advanced over the heavily mined road to Pietrovillamo. Medics of the 3rd Division gave wounded German soldiers more consideration than they bargained for. Civilians also needed medical care. General Truscott's 3rd Division fighters had driven the enemy from several mountain heights. They were showing signs of exhaustion. In the Venafro area on 3rd November, the 6th Corps crossed the Volturno for the 3rd time. The 3rd Division continued to press against Mignano. 504th Parachute Infantry on the right drove high into the mountains and guarded 5th Army's right flank. The 34th Division above Capriati crossed the river north of Venafro. The 45th Division moved up from Corps Reserve through Venafro and drove to push the Germans from the mountains beyond. Once more, our engineers faced the task of bridging the Volturno. Wind and rain continued. On 4th November, the Volturno, lashed by a wind of hurricane velocity, changed overnight into a raging torrent. Against all difficulties, bridges had to be replaced quickly to keep supplies moving. Wherever possible, light vehicles crossed over the riverbed. The November rain came down unceasingly. Bivouac areas became flooded fields of mud. Military operations came almost to a standstill. Roads were stretches of mire that became deeper as we pushed into the mountains. Streams flooded over their banks, washed away temporary bridges and bypasses. All along the front, vehicles bogged down in mud. It was a back-breaking job to drain the almost liquid mud from the roads. The forward movement of men and supplies became slower and slower. In the mountains, water gushed across the surfaced roads and roadbeds were washed out. By mid-November, transportation was almost at a standstill. Precious time lost, which the Germans used skillfully to build a new, strong line of defense. The German winter line in the mountains above Mignano and Venafro. An immediate offensive against this line was impossible. There was too much work to be done behind our line, on bridges made useless by the enemy and the weather, on roads which were constantly a serious problem. Rock quarries supplied tons of crushed stone needed to fill in mud-soaked roads. From the front to far behind the lines, preparation went on for the 5th Army offensive against the German winter line. In the mountains were miles of trails over which supplies could be carried only on the backs of mules. The average Italian mule could support 220 pounds. 250 mules were required to supply the basic needs of an infantry regiment in the line. There could have been no winter campaign without mules. On the flats, our trucks could churn through the mud. On the highest slopes, only men carrying light loads could make the ascent. Between these two extremes, the use of mules was an absolute necessity. After 2 weeks on 1st December, we were ready to attack the winter line. On the right, the 6th Corps with the 34th and 45th Divisions was in contact with the British 8th Army. On the left, the British 10th Corps was made up of the 46th and 56th Divisions, poised to cross the Garigliano River. At this time, a new corps, the 2nd, was brought into the center of the line and assigned command of the 36th and 3rd Division. Attached to this corps were the 1st Special Service Force, highly trained American and Canadian troops, the 1st Italian Motorized Group, and the American 1st Armored Division. This force was concentrated against the Mignano Gap, which we had to enter in order to break through to the Liri Valley, which led to Rome. The Mignano Gap is a narrow valley squeezed between mountain masses, Mount Camino to the south and Mount Samucro to the north, on the side of which is built the town of San Pietro. Like a stopper in this bottleneck, Mount Lungo rises from the floor of this valley. Beyond Mount Lungo, there were further mountain barriers, including Mount Trocchio. Our offensive started with Operation Raincoat, code name for a thrust on the left of Mignano Gap at the Camino Hills. Late afternoon, 2nd December, 925 field pieces poured tons of shells into enemy positions. Backed by this strong artillery support, the 1st Special Service Force captured Mount La Defensa and Mount La Rematagna. The 56th Division took Mount Camino. The 36th captured Mount Maggiore. By 10th December, Operation Raincoat was completed successfully. Troops of the 1st Italian Motorized Group moved into the Mignano area to join the 36th Division. This marked the first occasion of Italian soldiers fighting side by side with Americans. It was decided that Italian troops should strike to take Mount Lungo. A 2nd Corps artillery barrage supported the effort. The Germans were too well entrenched on Mount Lungo. By noon, it was apparent that the Italian assault had failed. Losses were so excessive that further operations against Mount Lungo were postponed for the time being. Instead, we decided to take the town of San Pietro at the foot of the mountains. Now, our artillery pounded and repounded the enemy defenses guarding San Pietro. The next day, the 504th paratroopers were sent out to secure the hills above San Pietro. Mules carried their weapons and ammunition up the steep slopes. On 15th December, a week after their first attempt, the 143rd Regiment again moved into position for an attack on the town. On the narrow, heavily mined road to San Pietro, 16 tanks under direct enemy observation led the way for the infantry assault. The lead tank, 3 hours later, reached the edge of San Pietro. Enemy shells fired on the tank, hitting closer and closer before knocking it out. At the end of the day, only 4 of the 16 tanks returned. Enemy decision to abandon San Pietro came after we'd won Mount Lungo. On 17th December, our lines moved into the town. From the hills above, the 504th Parachute troops descended on San Pietro. No matter how hasty their retreat, the Germans never failed to leave their mines and booby traps in the rubble of a destroyed Italian town. Few prisoners were taken in the battle for San Pietro. The German withdrawal was well executed. It was a costly battle. The 143rd Regiment alone required 1,100 replacements. Many companies lost all their officers. Enlisted men led those battered units forward. This was the scene of 3 weeks of the bitterest fighting on the 5th Army front. For 17 days, the target for the heaviest artillery concentration of the Italian campaign. The people of San Pietro came out of the caves in which they had hidden for weeks. They found little of their belongings to salvage. 2 days after the battle, General Eisenhower visited the San Pietro area for a conference with division commanders. From the hills above the town, the general could see our shells falling 2 miles northwest on the town of San Vittore, our next objective. In mud, rain, in cold, biting wind, our troops had driven the enemy from Mount Lungo, reaching the top by 16th December. This finally opened the way through the Mignano Gap. Troops of the 142nd on the mountain were relieved by the 15th Infantry, 3rd Division. While the battle for San Pietro was being fought, on our right flank, the 34th and 45th made diversionary attacks high in the mountains. On 15th December, the 6th Corps was poised for an offensive to coincide with the taking of San Pietro. Moroccan troops executed a wide envelopment of the German left flank, while 2 battalions of French Gaumiers prepared to advance west through high mountains to attack toward Cardito. Mountain fighting on this front was the most difficult of the campaign. In 6 days, the 6th Corps gained 3 miles, keeping pace with the 2nd Corps at San Pietro. Gaumiers, accustomed to quick stabs in mountain warfare, proved a valuable arm to the 5th Army. With the approach of Christmas, the 5th Army made every attempt to provide a turkey dinner to men in foxholes all along the front. From field kitchens, the dinner, packed in Marmite cans, was brought up the steep roads into the mountains. At the end of the jeep trails, mules carried the jugs farther into the heights. Higher, where terrain was too rough for mules, soldiers brought up turkey and Christmas mail by hand. Christmas Day, 1943, at the front, 45th Division sector. Along the entire 5th Army front, the holiday of good cheer was celebrated in the cold, desolate Italian mountains. Christmas Day was not a holiday everywhere over the world in 1943. On 28th December, the bodies of 3rd Division dead, killed defending Mount Lungo, were carried down the mountain. Because of the difficult terrain, it was 3 days before they could be brought down for burial. There was a short period of inactivity at Mount Sammucro, while the 2nd Corps regrouped forces and brought up fresh troops to initiate the final phase of the Winter Line campaign. On 1st January, the 2nd Corps saluted the new year with an artillery salvo on German defenses guarding San Vittore. Smoke rose from the stone houses and narrow streets of San Vittore. Shells fell on enemy entrenchments on Mount La Chiaia to the northwest. With control of Mignano Gap, the heights flanking Highway 6 were all that remained of the Winter Line. Following the opening attack, 3 more attacks beat against the remaining enemy positions. Mortar and artillery fire burst out over the entire 2nd Corps front. American bombers joined the assault. We were smashing into the last strong points of the Winter Line. The 168th Infantry outflanked Mount La Chiaia and struck west to capture Savaro on 12th January. At the same time, the 135th Infantry fought to take San Vittore. After 3 days, on 7th January, the last of fierce street fighting ended. The town, although severely damaged, was not as hard hit as San Pietro. In the Winter Line campaign, we had taken a large toll of enemy equipment and captured over 2,000 soldiers. As San Vittore fell, the 6th Armored Infantry on the 2nd Corps left flank drove to Mount Forchia, south of the important Highway 6. 3 German infantry companies of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division were rushed in by the enemy to hold the mountain. Though the Germans created some confusion, our reinforced troops held on to their guns. On 7th January, with tank and artillery fire blazing behind them, our infantry reached the crest of Mount Porcia. 8 days later, our 135th Infantry reached the top of Mount Trocchio, the last height of the winter line. Now the 5th Army stood before Cassino, guarding Highway number 6, the road to Rome. Here, tall, cliff-faced mountains, like an endless row of fortresses, cut across Italy. Around this natural barrier, the Germans built a new line.
By mid-January 1944, we and our allies had cleared the enemy from the mountains east of Cassino and had drawn up to the east side of the Rapido Valley. The allies faced a river, minefields, and barbed wire, all covered by enfilading machine gun fire. The first attempted crossing north of Cassino failed at the riverbank. The Nazis, in this deadly chess game, altered the course of the river, flooding the irrigation ditches, washing out roads, and turning the valley into a swamp. Finally, the tanks used the dry riverbed itself as a route. This attack, with protective cover, carried successfully up to Mount Castellone and Hill 593. The southern attack from San Angelo had already been stopped at the Rapido. Our troops fought their way into town 3 times. The 4th time we stayed. We strained forward to inch up Abbey Hill, from which we could cut Highway 6 and take Cassino from the rear. Whoever dominated the summits of the hills around Cassino dominated the town and the roads leading in and out of it. Enemy observers in the monastery saw our every move the moment we made it. The artillery in the monastery and along the slopes prevented us from reaching the summit, even though we had established positions in the town itself. On February 9th, 75 yards from the Abbey, we were stopped. Here the lines remained for 2 months. The enemy still held the greater part of Cassino and the Monte Cassino Abbey. It became a question of destroying a monument or sacrificing our men. There was actually no question. The troops were withdrawn 1,000 yards. A leaflet was prepared to warn the civilian population to evacuate. Right behind the front lines, they were packed into thin-skinned shells. On impact, the shell would split open. And now, carefully concealed, camouflaged 105 howitzers on gun carriages opened up with a bombardment of warning. (9:28 a.m., February 18th). A-20s were airborne. 226 bombers took part in the attack. Wave after wave of B-25s and later B-17s, B-24s, B-26s planted more than 500 tons of bombs in 4 hours. Between waves, our heavy artillery took up the bombardment. Bombardment, the stalemate still existed. The Germans filtered back into their positions on Mount Cassino, reinforced their strongholds in the town. Over Route 6 and through tunnels from the Ducal Palace, supplies streamed into the Nazi Green Devil Parachute Division, clinging to the amphitheater, the Colosseum, the Ducal Palace, the railroad station, the Hotel des Roses, the Yellow House, the Continental Hotel, Castle Hill, and Hill 165. These points were ordered to resist to the last man. Against the menace of the Nazi heights, we held Mount Trocchio. By Trocchio and on Mount Castellone and all along our line, we placed the most massive concentration of artillery pieces of the Italian campaign. From the smallest mortars and howitzers on the border of no man's land to 155 long toms and 240 howitzers in the rear, we were ready to begin the third and fiercest attack. The rear of our lines was a beehive of activity. Troops and M4 Shermans moved up, and at every airfield in the Italian theater, planes were being ready to wipe a city off the map. .155 long toms were dragged by M4 prime movers into their positions. The positions were carefully chosen to keep down the chance of detection by enemy air or ground observation. The crews were ready, eager. This was the kind of show they had trained for, training that blended these guns completely with landscape. And at last, the 240 howitzer, emplaced with the help of a crane and a prime mover improvised out of an obsolete Sherman tank. Emplacing one of these giants was a specialist job, and every man of the 32 in this section knew each move he had to make, from establishing the line of fire before the howitzer was mounted to inspecting it after the operations were finished. Finally, additional sound plots. With poor visibility, this equipment would be invaluable. The location of each microphone was carefully selected for the best reaction. After that, the line was checked by phone. It checked, so the cylinder was connected and enclosed in a watertight bag. One of the men tested it for sound. It was suspended and finally concealed under a loose layer of dirt. Now, should an enemy gun fire, the microphones would pick up the sound. It would be recorded on film either at a special laboratory or at the command post. The time intervals would be called off to the computer, relayed to the plotting table, and translated into distances. The plotters would then locate the positions of the enemy guns, check them on a terrain map, and phone in the grid numbers to battalion headquarters. And so even if the enemy gun flash were obscured, we'd be able to return his fire within 5 yards of his emplacement. 0830, March 15th. Again, we took to the air. First, the mediums. They came from Sardinia, Corsica, everywhere. The heavies of the Strategic Air Force, B-24s, B-17s, 1,400 tons in 4.5 hours. But nothing was finished. When we stormed what was left of the town, we found that rubble made good concealment for the enemy. Debris made good roadblocks against our tanks. The Nazis' return fire was as strong as ever. We were stopped. But in staff headquarters, new plans of action were on the fire. We will move ahead. We are moving ahead, past Cassino and into the heart of the fortress Europe.